The Road to War. He examines President Abraham Lincoln's personal and political life, as well as his rise to power. Mr. van der Linden also goes into the political and individual battles that led the United States to civil war. He spoke at a suburban Washington, D.C. bookstore and is introduced by the store's community relations manager, Elizabeth Matthews.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to see everybody here tonight. I'm Elizabeth Matthews, the community relations manager for the store, so I welcome you in that capacity. Hopefully everybody can find a seat. There's one up front here as well. We are honored to have Frank van der Linden here with us tonight for a special President's Day event here at Barnes & Noble in honor of his new book, Lincoln, The Road to War. He is author of 5 books on American presidents, including The Turning Point, which is about Thomas Jefferson's battle for the presidency. And in addition, for half a century, Mr. van der Linden was a Washington newspaper correspondent covering Congress and the White House. So he definitely knows our presidents past and present. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Frank van der Linden. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Elizabeth Matthews. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I'm delighted to see so many lovers of history and books who are here. Very, very, very welcome to have so much of an audience here. That's just grand. I know that Barnes & Noble a good series going here and promoting books for all of us, and it's grand to be here. Now, no doubt you've seen a few reviews. You may know that the reviews have been pretty favorable, I think. One of the best, I think, is written by Dr. David Long, who is the professor of history in East Carolina, University of North Carolina, and author of The Jewel of Liberty, Abraham Lincoln's Re-Election and the End of Slavery. And he is therefore an expert on Lincoln. And he has said that my book is lively and provocative, and I quote, and I think he's right, because I try to make it lively, and I know that it's provocative because, as Dr. Long said, the main thesis of the book will be a cause of discomfort for many Civil War and Lincoln historians. And that's because the main thesis is that with more wisdom and patience and less political face-saving, the Union could have been saved by conciliation without the enormous cost of blood, which, as you know, was more than 600,000 dead in the 4 years of slaughter. I think the problem with the discomfort is that too many people have read only the standard histories, which seem to think that Lincoln was like that demigod you see at the Lincoln Memorial. He's larger than life and brooding down on the poor people below, and they don't want to believe that the man was really a human being, that he faced many problems, and that he made some mistakes. I think I could quote Lincoln himself as saying, as you may remember, in his annual message to Congress in December 1862, as our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. So I say that's true. We cannot escape history. We have to know what the truth is, and we must disenthrall ourselves from so many myths and legends about Lincoln. And this is the truth that I've tried to find through years of research, and it's the truth that's in this book. We must see Lincoln as he arrived in Washington on February the 23rd, 1861. This was just after he had received those assassination threats. He was warned that if he came into Baltimore in the daylight, he'd be mobbed and probably murdered. So it was arranged for him to slip into town in a sleeping car in the middle of the night. He arrived here at 6 a.m., and he was criticized for it and ridiculed for it, but those who warned him were certainly well informed, the Army had spies inside of the camp of the plotters, and so did private detectives, and they both agreed on the danger. So he knew then that he was coming into a city. Washington, D.C. was also not a very welcome haven for him, because most of the people here, I would call them secesh. By that time, the 7 southern states, from forming a block from South Carolina to Texas, had seceded and formed the Confederate States of America, and the fire eaters who pulled this coup were pressuring the 8 other reluctant states of the Upper South to jump aboard the bandwagon too. Furthermore, poor Lincoln, as soon as he arrived in town, had to battle a horde of people who simply wanted federal jobs. There must have been 10 people for every job at least, and they swarmed all over his hotel. And then when he finally got into the White House, they were all over the White House and the federal offices. And unfortunately, he seemed to think he was obligated to talk to all these people personally. You know, today nobody would ever dream of that. It'd be delegated to 2 or 3 underlings to do all this screening, but he thought he ought to do it, so he just about wore himself out, just talking to all these people, each one of whom claimed that he was the one that carried a certain county for him and was always Republican, although the chances are not many of them had ever voted Republican before. So at any rate, he also found that he was whipsawed between 2 factions of his own party. The radical Republicans were calling him for use force to regain the forts and other property seized by the seceding states. And the moderates implored him to avoid any coercion so that he could hold the 8 Upper South states that did not want to leave. In his inaugural address on March the 4th, Lincoln took a pretty strong line. He pledged that he would, this is a quote, hold, occupy, and possess the federal property. Well, the Southerners took that to mean that he was going to use force to do it. In fact, the original draft of the speech called for a pledge to recapture the forts that had been captured, and Senator Seward persuaded him to take that out, otherwise he might lose the border states who would think he was going to start a war overnight. But Lincoln was very shrewd. He tried to blame the South for any war that might result. And this is what he said, quote, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is a momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without yourselves being the aggressors." I think you could say that Lincoln was a master of the modern propaganda, because he was able to at least try to pin the word aggressor on the other side. Well, now, on his first full day in the White House, he'd hardly found his way from one room to the next, and he had no experience, as you know, in being executive of anything, except a little post office way back in his youth. He got a shock in the mail because Major Robert Anderson, the commander of Fort Sumter at Charleston, said in this letter that his food and other supplies are running out, and he must soon give up the fort unless relieved. He said it would take 20,000 troops. Well, General Winfield Scott, the Army commander, agreed that as a military necessity, the fort must be given up. There weren't 20,000 troops in the whole United States Army. Well, every member of the cabinet agreed that as much as they disliked it, they were going to have to give up the fort. There was only one exception. That was the Postmaster General, Montgomery Blair of Silver Spring, Maryland. The cabinet made this informal decision on March the 9th. Now, only 2 days later, General Scott drafted a proposed order to Major Anderson saying, "You will, after communicating your purpose to the governor of South Carolina, engage suitable water transportation and peacefully evacuate Fort Sumter, and with your entire command embark for New York." That would seem to end it, wouldn't it? Here's the order. The order is in the Lincoln Papers at the Library of Congress. I've seen it. But you know the reason it's in the Lincoln Papers is he never did send it. He just could not bring himself to send it. He dreaded to face the humiliation of giving up the fort after all his brave talk and his pledge to hold, occupy, and possess that property. He knew the Democrats were going to make political hay out of it, and the only excuse the Republican propagandists could muster when they planted the story in the newspapers it was going to have to be done, they said, well, don't blame Lincoln for it. We have to give up the fort because his predecessor, that old fuddy-duddy James Buchanan, the Democrat, failed to reinforce the fort when he had time. So it's all Buchanan's fault and the Democrats, so don't blame the Republicans. If that sounds like familiar politics of today, it's not just a coincidence, I guess. Well, Montgomery Blair brought his brother-in-law, Gustavus B. Fox, who was a former Navy captain, to sell Lincoln on a plan for bringing troops and supplies into Sumter aboard several small boats backed by a fleet of warships. Fox proposed that these little tugs would come in under the Confederate guns and come at high tide, and they could come into the Charleston harbor at night and no doubt draw the fire of the rebel guns. Then the warships could come in and help the fort gunners in firing back. And of course, the war would be on. But even so, Lincoln could still say that he just sent those little boats down there to bring bread to the hungry troops. And that was his position. So he said, I'm not making an invasion, I'm not making an attack, I'm just trying to feed those hungry soldiers. Now, William Henry Seward, who has been made as Secretary of State, was the leader of the peace forces inside the Republican Party, and he used all his power to block the Blair-Fox plan and commit Lincoln to giving up Fort Sumter. Seward worked through Supreme Court Justice John Campbell, who was a pro-Union man from Alabama, and Campbell served as a go-between to pass the word to the Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his 3 commissioners who were in Washington. And this way, Lincoln was not involved at all. Seward was making these indirect and unofficial promises. But at any rate, Seward assured the Confederates that since the cabinet had already voted, with one exception, to give up the fort would be given up soon after the middle of March. Well, didn't turn out that way. And on the 21st of March, one of Lincoln's closest friends, Ward Hill Lamon, he was the well-armed giant who accompanied Lincoln on that midnight ride through Baltimore, armed with 2 guns and 3 knives, I understand. So Lamon visited Governor Pickens at Charleston and brought a message allegedly from Lincoln and said that he was to arrange for the Sumter troops to be taken away. And he asked the governor if he could bring in a warship, and the governor said no, but you can bring a civilian steamer and they can come out with full military honors, so everything seemed to be all set. But Gustavus Fox also came to Charleston for just the opposite purpose. He was there to get the lay of the land and prepare for the relief expedition. He came back to Washington, sold Lincoln on his scheme. The question is, how was he able to turn Lincoln around? Well, the answer is that the news of the cabinet's decision to give up the fort had been leaked to the newspapers. And while the newspapers were first saying, well, we have to do it, it stirred up a tremendous firestorm of protest from Republicans, members of the Senate, and governors, and ordinary Republican voters, especially in the Northwest. Those people were angry and betrayed, and this is a typical one that a New York Republican wrote to Lincoln, and there are a stack of these in the Lincoln papers. That's why it's fun to do research. This is what he said: "You're as weak and vacillating as old Buchanan. Give up Sumter, sir, and you're as dead politically as John Brown is physically. You have got to either act immediately and decisively or resign and go home." A few letters like that will shake anybody. Well, on March the 28th, Lincoln spent a sleepless night. He was torn by his conflicting emotions. He wanted to make a brave stand in defense of the fort, but he knew that if he did that, it would start a civil war. And he was also sick and tired of those office seekers who were just about to ruin his health. The next morning, the exhausted president was in the dumps and keeled over, as Mary Lincoln, his wife, said, with a sick headache. He was really, I think, in emotional turmoil and probably a psychosomatic illness. As you know, Lincoln was subject to melancholy moods and blue moods, as he called them, and this was certainly a reason to have one. So the reason, of course, for his trouble was the conflict between the duty, as he saw it, to show that we have a government, and also his duty to try to hold the peace if he could, because he repeatedly told people, I don't want any war. I'm for peace, but I have to run the government, and I cannot ever admit that the 7 states in the South make up a separate country. I'm not going to do it. Well, on March the 30th, the Confederate commissioners in Washington received a telegram from Governor Pickens asking, why are the Yankee troops still at Fort Sumter? They were supposed to have been taken out of here several days ago. What's wrong? What went wrong? So Seward checked with the president and found out what the latest word was, and he told Justice Campbell that Lincoln totally disavowed everything Ward Lamon had told the governor, that Lamon had no authority to speak for him at all. Well, by that time, I think some of the Confederates began to think they were the victims of the old shell game. Justice Campbell said, well, what shall I tell the Confederate commissioners now? And Seward replied, the president may desire to supply Fort Sumter, but will not undertake to do so without giving notice to Governor Pickens. Well, this certainly was a drastic change in policy. Does the president design to attempt to supply Sumter, Campbell asked. No, I think not, Seward answered. It's a very irksome thing for him to evacuate it. His ears are open to everyone, and they fill his head with schemes for its supply. I don't think he will accept any of them. Well, Seward didn't want him to do it, but of course, the truth was that the secessionists were counting on just a clash at Charleston to make Virginia and the other pro-Union states of the Upper South secede. So he persuaded Lincoln to invite a leader of the pro-Union forces in the Virginia Convention and offer some deal that could keep Virginia in the Union. A man named John B. Baldwin, who was a big leader of the Union forces in the Richmond Convention, came on April the 4th. Lincoln led him into a White House bedroom and locked the door. Lincoln demanded that Virginia adjourn its convention without voting for secession. He said that you have a 2-to-1 Union majority down there. Why don't you just go on home and don't do anything more? But Baldwin said, well, if we did that, they'd simply organize another convention. They would probably secede too. And he warned him that sending the supply ship to Sumter would surely start a war. He said, if there's a gun fired at Fort Sumter, as surely as there is a God in heaven, the thing is gone. Virginia, as strong as the Union majority in the convention is now, will be out in 48 hours. Oh, said Lincoln, that's impossible. You see, Lincoln just wouldn't believe that these people were in earnest. He first thought the idea of secession was just, a lot of hokum, but he learned very, very, very the hard way that it wasn't true. Baldwin later denied reports that Lincoln had offered him a deal that if the Virginia Convention would adjourn at once without voting for secession, he'd withdraw the troops from Sumter. Now, he had earlier said to a group of border state Union men that if Virginia would stay firm, he would pull out the troops at Charleston. But he never put this in writing to anybody, and Baldwin always said, he never gave me any kind of pledge like that. We may have talked a little bit about it. This thing has been a matter of controversy ever since, whether this was a real pledge or just a little conversation. But on the same day of the Baldwin visit, that's April the 4th, several northern governors had a long interview with Lincoln. Now, these men were all strong Republicans. They were the ones that largely responsible for his being elected. And they demanded that he hold both Fort Sumter and Fort Pickens in Florida, and they offered men and money to support a war. On April the 8th, as the fleet was leaving New York, Robert S. Chew of the State Department arrived in Charleston and read to Governor Pickens this notice from Lincoln. An attempt will be made to supply Fort Sumter with provisions only. and if such an attempt be not resisted, no effort to throw men, arms, and ammunition will be made without further notice or in case of an attack upon the fort. Well, that sounded like a little peaceful statement, but when you talk about throwing in men, arms, or ammunition, that was enough to make the Confederates think that's why those warships were out there. This wasn't just deliver a little bread to the hungry soldiers. The Confederates offered Major Anderson a chance to give up the fort peacefully if he had set a date for his departure. He really wanted to go. He'd been waiting around for a couple of weeks, expecting every day to get his order from General Scott to leave. He evidently had been told on the grapevine it was in the works, but of course he was disappointed it never did come. He deplored the idea of Americans killing each other, but he was honor-bound under his orders to stay while the fleet was on its way to aid him. So on the morning of April 12th, as everyone knows, the Confederates opened fire and battered the fort for 34 hours and forced it to run up the white flag. Remarkably, and Major Anderson thought providentially, no one was killed in the exchange of gunfire. On April 15th, Lincoln issued a proclamation calling upon the governors to send 75,000 troops to suppress the rebellion. Well, this proclamation and the fall of the fort touched off a wave of patriotic fever all over the North. But the governors of the slave states fired telegrams to Lincoln saying just the opposite. We're never going to send you any troops for this wicked purpose of subjugating the South. And the people in the South, a large number of pro-union leaders who have been trying so hard for months to keep their states from joining the other states in the jump off into the abyss, they were really outraged. Jonathan Worth, a future governor of North Carolina, is a good example. This conservative said, Lincoln had no right to call out the militia and make war and blockade the ports. If the restoration of Union was his object, he is a fool. If his purpose was to drive off all the slave states, to make war in them and annihilate slavery, then he's a devil. It seems a few people didn't like Lincoln. Lincoln's war policy completely cut the ground out from under all these Union-loving men who had been blocking the fire eaters from dragging the Upper South into secession. So now 4 more states, Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Arkansas, quickly went out, and the Confederacy expanded from a little league of 7 states to a much stronger bloc of 11 states, strong enough to carry on a long and bloody war. That quite unnecessary war could have been avoided if Lincoln had simply let the 7 cotton states alone to stew in their own juice for a few months. Because I don't believe the 7 cotton states were large enough or strong enough to maintain their claim to be a republic for much more than a year or so, especially if Lincoln had the blockade on. But when the size of the Confederacy was double, it made victory for the Union very, very, very difficult. I think he should have encouraged these pro-Union men in the South to reassure their people it was safe to stay in the old Union, and Seward thought the same thing. Seward constantly thought if you could talk to these Union leaders, such as those in Virginia, and build up a strong pro-Union party, even in the seceded states, that eventually they might come home. Now, Scott promoted this, and the old general was ridiculed for it because people called it General Scott's Bo Peep policy, that if the states were like in the Bo Peep rhyme, leave them alone and they will come home wagging their tails behind them. So it seems that the evidence would indicate that Lincoln was faced with a terrible decision. He was trying to keep his party together, trying to make it sure that he was the president of the whole country, and yet by sending even supplies to Sumter, he knew that was going to touch off a clash, and he knew the net result would be a war. But he was just clever enough or shrewd enough to make sure that it was the rebels that fired the first shot. And so he is revered as he ought to be as one of our greatest presidents because he restored the Union and freed the slaves. And both the goals were good and both could have been achieved by a policy of peace, although of course it would require a lot more time and patience. But anyone who says the Civil War was a good war or a moral war, and I read that all the time, I think of those 600,000 dead men and their grieving loved ones and all the wounded and the waste and the destruction. All of these people were sacrificed on the altar of partisanship on both sides in the terrible war that should never have been fought. Lincoln really had to make a choice between peace and power. Unfortunately, he chose power.
Due to technical difficulties, a brief portion of the program was lost. We continue with the Q&A.
I might accept that this was the final act in a series of things that have been occurring. But the Missouri Compromise, the Dred Scott decision, the fugitive slave law, there have been events going on for almost 10 years during that decade that had led to tremendous polarization. Lincoln was not even on the ballot in the southern states.
That's correct.
And 7 states had already seceded when a man walked in with no preparation at all to a governor that was tottering. So I don't know if I totally accept your hypothesis that the war could have been avoided and that it's all laid at Lincoln's feet because he chose to fortify Fort Sumter at that point. I'm not convinced of that. I'm just wondering.
Well, you just have to buy my book and read it. That's a clear answer. Because the evidence is all here. Somebody said the other day, I was told, he said, well, this is 20/20 hindsight. You know, anybody can figure out what could have happened for the best. But it's not 20/20 hindsight. The evidence is all here. You see, he had the choice before him. Practically all the cabinet, General Scott and all said, all you have to do is give up this fort. You don't need it. Has no military value. Its only value was as a symbol, because you see, nobody started a war when half a dozen other forts and the mints and everything else were grabbed by these southern states. Why was Sumter so much more valuable than all the others? Just because it was made a political symbol, and it was the Republican politicians that really pushed him into this.
But didn't it also go along with Lincoln's feeling that he maintained throughout the entire war that it was never a separate nation? He never accepted any peace delegates because they would acknowledge that there was a separate country.
Oh, no, he never would, and he never should have.
And he said it was always the United States, and he kept complaining his generals didn't understand. It was not their country versus ours, it's all our country.
Oh, that's
it's
right.
all over peace in terms of that. If it hadn't been Sumter, wouldn't it have been somewhere else?
Yeah, we see, well, the position of the New York Herald, which said that he made a mistake in doing this. He called it Lincoln's fateful mistake. The logic of the Herald was, if, as Lincoln said, all of these Southerners were still his constituents in the Union, then the United States government had no business waging war against its own people. That's a little one hard to get out of. That's the New York Herald's view. Yeah, somebody else must have a question. Yeah.
Okay, so if Lincoln was wrong to fight the war to preserve the Union and free the slaves, how would a peaceful solution have led to freeing the slaves?
Well, it would have taken a lot longer, but it would have been done in the end the same way it was finally done, which is by the passage of the Constitutional Amendment. The Constitutional Amendment, the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, the legal and official way to do it, was passed in 1865. I don't think it would have been passed that soon.
No. Not with the Southern
No, it would
states
not have been passed that soon. And the reason it wouldn't have been passed any sooner was not only the opposition of the South, but opposition of the North. It's just now, I think most people beginning to realize that the abolitionists were a very small minority of the Northern people at the outbreak of the war. And Lincoln himself never claimed to be an abolitionist. In fact, when his opponents tried to call him one, he always very indignantly said he's not, because an abolitionist was a dirty word when he was running for the Senate in '58. Yeah.
But he spoke, when did he speak? He spoke against slavery way before he was ever elected, in public.
Yeah.
Oh,
When
he
he was a
always said,
when he was
in my
representative.
personal view,
Yeah, he
in
was
my
always.
personal wish is that all men may be free. But he said no legal way to do it without a constitutional amendment.
Right.
And the only way he was able, with the Emancipation Proclamation, to declare the freedom of those inside the rebel lines was as a military measure. And it worried him that he even went that far. As a lawyer, he said, well, I really don't have authority to do this, but if it helps to win the war, then I can rationalize it. And the same thing was done with the Confiscation Act, with the suspension of habeas corpus, and a whole lot of things he didn't give him much credit for doing. All war measures, but to do it and make it permanent would have to be a constitutional amendment. And that's what was finally done, of course. Yeah. Somebody else. Yes.
How much of the popular vote had Lincoln received from within those, ultimately the Confederate states?
Well, in about 10 states, his name wasn't even on the ballot. He got a few thousand votes in states like Maryland, Kentucky, Virginia, and so on. In Maryland, he ran fourth in a field of 4. That's how popular he was in Maryland, which is an upper South state. The state went for Breckinridge by a narrow margin over John Bell, the Constitutional Union candidate, but Lincoln had only the Blair family and a few other friends, I think. This is why he knew that when they told him he might be mobbed in Baltimore, they weren't kidding, because neither the mayor or the governor or anybody else in Maryland had sent him any kind of an official welcome to our state. You know, he'd been touring all over the North, and everywhere he went, he was welcomed by the mayors and governors and everybody. Maryland, dead silence. So he knew he was going into the enemy's country then, yeah.
One more question, if I may. We've always heard an awful lot about the morality and integrity of Lincoln the man, and I'm wondering, and maybe I'll discover in reading, I'm wondering how much of the personal integrity and morality weight did he use in making the decision to go to war, and how much do you feel it was political? Can you give any kind of balance?
He was torn between these two great emotional desires. That is, he wanted to assert that he was president and we had a government, we had a nation, but when it was perfectly clear that whatever he did along the lines of force, whether it's sending the fleet to Charleston or invading a state or anything else, he was bound to have a clash because it was almost inevitable. And that was his problem. No, his personal integrity, I think, is absolutely 100%. As a matter of fact, I don't find anything in his personal life to be the least stain on it at all. I wish we had more presidents like that. So anyway, there was a lot of corruption in the administration. One reason that Lincoln was elected was there'd been a certain amount of corruption in the Democratic administration under Buchanan, but this was little things like buying votes of congressmen to put a bill through, or hiring a pet of the president to run the government printing, and who farmed it out to somebody else. Nice little payoffs, but those were penny-ante things, but they were a shock to the voters in 1860 because they weren't used to that kind of corruption. But of course, compared to that, it was like the multi-million-dollar scandals in war procurement. But of course, Lincoln wasn't personally blamed for those. But anybody who's read about the Civil War knows about the millionaires of shoddy who made fortunes selling shoddy uniforms to the soldiers. Their uniforms would fall apart in the first rain. And that was just one example. A gunpowder that wouldn't fire, with the scandals forever on that. And part of that's, of course, inevitable in any war. It certainly wasn't Lincoln's fault. Yeah, I'm way in the back.
Yes. Mr. Vanderlinden, what is your opinion of the authenticity of the Dahlgren papers and the endorsement of that operation by President Lincoln?
Well, what I read about it, and I'm not an expert on it, it seems to me that you have to take General Lee's word for it. If General Lee's integrity is as good as Lincoln, General Lee certified that these were not fakes, that these orders supposedly signed by Dahlgren were correct. I'll summarize this for everybody. In early 1864, a group of Union soldiers led by Ulrich Dahlgren, who was a friend of the Lincoln family, made a raid on Richmond, and the idea was to free the Union prisoners in Libby Prison. And according to the documents found on the body of Dahlgren after he was killed, they were supposed to attack Jefferson Davis, kill Davis and members of the cabinet, and burn Richmond. This, of course, created a huge a sensation in the North, and immediately the Northern press said, well, these are all fakes. But General Lee certified that they were not, and so it's a matter of controversy to this day. There's been a couple of new books written on it just recently. That's true. Somebody else may have something to add.
Right here.
One more. Yes.
I just wanted to ask, you said that you didn't really think the war needed to be fought because of the 600,000.
I tell you, I'm half deaf. You're going to have to holler or else come up to a mic.
You said that you felt that the war really didn't have to be fought because 600,000 men had died in the war.
That's right.
Okay, how much longer would slavery lasted, do you think, if the war hadn't been fought? And the reason I asked that...
I cannot hear you. I wish you'd come up.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
If the war hadn't been fought, how much longer do you think slavery would have lasted in this country?
Well, Lincoln himself, in his original proposal to the border states, called for it to be ended within 30 years. So that was Lincoln's own thinking on the subject in 1862. Now,
would that mean they would have lasted up to about 1900?
He couldn't sell the border states on it at that time. Perhaps with a little more persistence, he might have been able to be a better salesman. But his idea was that he was all for freeing the slaves. He wanted that done, and everybody today agrees it's a good thing. The problem was whether 4 million slaves, many of whom were illiterate through no fault of their own, some of whom had just come in from Africa through smuggling and all, could be turned loose without any kind of control at all. And I think most everybody, except the abolitionists, figured this was going to be a social problem, but have to be done gradually. I think it was just like the same flap we had here over integration. Those that said, well, it has to be done gradually or at deliberate speed and that sort of thing. It's a matter that most of the Southerners, even those who didn't own any slaves, have agreed with the slave system on because it provided a form of police control. That's why they liked it. And if you remember in Reconstruction, they tried to reestablish it. And it's really the Ku Klux Klan, you know. So you have a matter of public opinion, and you can't change it overnight, but I think that's what Lincoln realized. But then when he found out that it was necessary to do this in order to weaken the Confederate war effort, well, he agreed that I had to do it. Maybe the Southerners deserved it. He brought it on themselves. I'm sure a lot of people in the North felt like that. So it was good for the blacks. It was good for the blacks that the war occurred, of course.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
But it cost 600,000 lives. It wasn't very good for those fellows.
Yeah, well, my point is slavery needed to end, period. Slavery needed to end. And even though 600,000 died, millions of black folks have died in the institution of slavery just coming over.
Well, you can argue either side of it, sure.
Right, so as one that had descendants that were slaves, I would have
fought.
But
I died of 600,000 anyway.
No, at least 10 million. At least 10 million.
You have any figures to prove one side
yeah, I think so. I think so. But anyway, the basic of it is it needed to end.
Because it done in every other country.
But it needed to end.
You know, slavery used to be in effect all over the United States at the time of the Constitution.
But what I'm saying,
it was legal in the North and New York, Pennsylvania.
That doesn't excuse it.
They got rid of it.
That doesn't
excuse it. It just takes longer to get rid of it in a place where there's too much profit in it.
Right, but that doesn't excuse it.
South, there was still some profit left in it. In Delaware and Maryland, Western Virginia, Eastern Tennessee, there was practically the slave system just about abolished by the time of the war.
Okay.
And actually, I know I read a letter by Senator Robert Toombs of Georgia before the war when he was arguing for immediate secession. He said he got tired of listening to these compromisers that said, give Lincoln a chance, you know, and he'll be all right. He says, you mark my words, he said in effect, if we ever let a Republican administration get in here, they'll build up an anti-slavery party in every southern state, and within a few years, Maryland and Delaware and Maryland and North Carolina and Virginia will all be abolitionized. And this was one reason that the secessionists struck when they did in 1860, because they saw that slavery eventually was doomed. The only question is how long it was going to take. It would have lingered a long time in the Deep South. No question about that. But in the Upper South, I think it was on the way out already.
Okay. My only point is I supported the war because I think slavery needed to end, and I'm glad it was fought. And I think I was just one who felt disagreed that it just, conflict needed to be fought to end that institution.
Well, it's easy for us to say because we're not going to get shot.
Well, as being a black man, I would have fought.
Of course.
I would have happily would have fought back then.
Sure, of course.
Thank
So
you.
That's the reason for different points of view. Somebody else has a question. If not, yes.
Frank,
Yes, Jacques.
at that time, the United States was virtually the last country where slavery was legally established.
Mm-hmm.
The Caribbean countries, slavery had already been abolished.
Yes, the British had abolished it in all their possessions.
That's correct. Was there any international pressure at that time that might have influenced Lincoln?
I think from the British, I would say, yeah. Brazil was the only really big country that still had slavery, and it stayed there until 1889, I think. But of course, one reason that John C. Calhoun advocated annexing Texas way back in 1845 was, and you find that in his letters, he says, well, if we don't do this, take it in, the British will take it over, and we'll have abolition in Texas and right on our doorstep. And that was the same reason given for all the agitation in the 1850s to take Cuba. You know, President Buchanan, when he was minister to England, and the others signed the Ostend Manifesto, saying, in effect, we want to buy Cuba from Spain, and Spain won't say it, we'll take it anyway. Well, the argument by the Deep South people, particularly the senators from Louisiana, was if the British get in there, they may take over Cuba, and then we'll have abolition right off the coast of Florida. So this was the real problem. The slave power, as the Northerners called it, there's no question, had a lot of influence in the federal government, and really so many policies were dictated by the Southern senators. In fact, they were the ones who, about half of this, the first half of this book is about the battle inside the Democratic Party over the nomination and why they wound up with 2 tickets. And one reason was that the nominations in the 50s were controlled by a little coterie of senators, most of them from the South, but not all. There were some from Pennsylvania, Indiana, California. They all worked together in a cabal, and they ran the Senate, and through the Senate, they ran the party and they ran the country. But they didn't want Steve Douglas to be the presidential nominee because he wasn't their boy. And if he got in, they'd all be out. And this is about, a large part of this book is about that struggle, which was, of course, enabled Lincoln to be elected, even though he had only 39% of the vote. When you have 3 opponents, it's a lot easier, you know. If you've got 39%, that's enough. And he was certainly constitutionally elected, but some of the battles among the Democrats were a lot of fun to research, too. Yeah.
A non-Civil War question.
Yeah.
You dedicated the book to your brother,
That's
who
right.
spells his name differently.
Yeah, you're a sharp
story?
observer, very sharp observer.
Does he not agree with you?
I had to insist on the publisher on that. Our name is spelled 3 different ways. My grandfather spelled it my way. He was a Dutch immigrant. That's the correct Dutch way. When my father was in school, some teacher cut it in 2 pieces. So he was always known in 2 pieces, Vander and London. And I decided that when I started writing books that I was going to go back to the old Dutch way. And meanwhile, my brother was in the Army. The Army wouldn't take me because I couldn't see anything. But he was in the Army, and he in order to get his record straight, he ran the name together the way our rich cousins, the Vanderbilts, do. And that way he didn't get his mail. He thought, I know I get my mail all mixed up. I get letters to Mr. Van and Mr. Durr and Mr. Linden and all that stuff. It's inevitable. And there's also questions of whether to capitalize the B or the D or run it all together. It's all a matter of taste. But this is the only family I know where you have 3 different versions in the same family. But that's the way he wanted it, and that's the way his widow signs it. So we keep peace in the family very well that way.
Perhaps that's a nice non-political note to end on. So thank you all for coming, and I'm sure he will take your questions following.
Thank you. Thank you.
Frank van der Linden has been a syndicated columnist, as well as a White House correspondent for several newspapers. His book, Lincoln, The Road to War, is published by Fulcrum Publishing, 350 Indiana Street, Suite 350, Golden, Colorado, 80401. Mr. van der Linden's other books include The Turning Point, Jefferson's Battle for the Presidency, and The Real Reagan.